Once upon a time, there was a little mushroom patch in the woods. The sun was beaming down on the rich, wet earth, and the mushrooms grew large and plump and succulent. However, this was no ordinary mushroom patch, no. The spores that grew these mushrooms could grow other things too. Deep underground in their fungal cocoons, something began to stir. The soft earth began to move as a small creature began to claw its way to the surface. It was a snotling, a little snotling, smaller than a Gretchen, dumber than an orc, but they are still the first orcoid creatures to sprout out of the ground as they lay the foundation for what might one day become a mighty orc tribe. The snotling gasped for air as its big beaky nose and large flapping ears emerged from the ground. Once free, the little snotling sat and looked at the beauty all around him. The sun, the sky, the trees, all of the beauty and majesty of the world lay before him for the first time. And the snotling sat and picked his nose. He was tired after all that digging. After a short rest, the new snotling began to feel hungry. He quickly moved towards the delicious-looking mushrooms growing in the patch. He plucked one up and bit into it. While wandering around the patch, he also found a scrap of old rotten skin left over from some weeks-old carcass. The snotling tied the scrap of skin around his waist and stuffed one of the mushrooms into his waistband so he could eat it later. The tiny green skin's even tinier brain began to think. There was something he needed to do. While his brain was slowly shorting out from the effort, the snotling's nose began to twitch. He smelled a good smell. As bad as his brain was at thinking, it had a few simple instincts. Good smells were good. Bring good smells back. The aroma wafted through the air, and it was rank, foul, and putrid. It was perfect. Perfect for the pile. The little snotling was about to run off in the direction of that wondrous smell to plop it right into the middle of the mushroom. But a second thought entered the little greenskin's head. Fear and aggression. He might need to bash something good. Or maybe poke it, so he didn't get eaten. He decided that both was good. The snotling grabbed a sizable rock in one hand and found a bit of root. He promptly gnawed on it until it was a proper pointy stick. With rock and stick in hand, the littlest snotling ran off into the woods to find that most wonderful smell. The littlest snotling slowed his pace as he began drawing close to the smell. A dark shape suddenly passed overhead, and the littlest snotling shrieked and dove for cover into a nearby bush. From the bush, the tiny greenskin could see the carcass of some beast. The dark shape that flew overhead was some kind of ugly bird with no feathers around its head. It landed next to two other birds and began pecking at the carcass, tearing away strips of meat. The snotling's tiny brain had two simple responses to most situations. Cowardice. Run away from the flying scary things. 2. Violence. Bash the ugly flying things and bring the good smell back. The rage of Gork and Mork seemed to fill this tiny creature as it suddenly rushed forward, rock in hand, screeching. He hurled it with all its might and struck one of the startled bird creatures directly in the head. The winged beast awkwardly squawked and fled from the wrath of the tiny green skin. The other two birds began to spread their wings menacingly and hop towards the snotling. The greenskin wanted to throw his rock again, but then he realized that throwing his rock made it go away. So he gripped his tiny wooden stabber and charged at the creatures with a ferocity quite uncommon for snotlings. With all the strength his little arms could muster, he viciously stabbed into the chest of the first beast, which began squawking and screeching in pain, beating its wings, buffeting the snotling around the head and disorienting him, before it managed to take off and flee from the aggressor. The snotling shook his head, trying to get his bearings after being battered a bit. But he opened his eyes to find the last strange bird looming over him. The thing puked on him. The disease-ridden stomach acids of the creature poured over the snotling's head and went directly into his eyes. There was a violent hiss as the little greenskin shrieked in pain as his face steamed and began to melt away. Blind and enraged, his simple mind could only think of one thing to do. "Fugoken Mook! Wah!" And the little greenskin charged in blindly at the bird, swinging his stick wildly, striking again and again, fighting through the searing pain. Perhaps it was the hand of Gork and Mork, because they were pleased by the ferocity of this smallest of greenskins. Perhaps it was that the great green gods smiled upon him. Or maybe the snotling was incredibly lucky. But the last remaining creature was struck and stabbed several times before fleeing just as the others did. The snotling was disfigured, burned, and blind. But he was still alive. He made liberal use of his enormous nose to sniff out where the rotten meat exactly was. Bring the good smell back. Feeling about with his hands, the little snotling eventually grabbed a hold of the rotting carcass and began to drag it back to the patch. After running into several trees on his way back, the littlest snotling felt his burden suddenly become light. 3 other snotlings had sprouted from the patch, and they had arrived to help him carry the good smell the rest of the way home. Now, greenskins have a very strong ability to heal themselves because of their simple and robust nature. Believe it or not, the little snotling was slowly recovering his vision after being viciously burned by the winged creature. But his skin was now horribly scarred. But again, he was alive. As he regained his vision, he could actually tell that he was a bit taller than the other snotlings. This meant that he was the boss. The snotling decided that he should have a name for himself. Boss snotlings got to have names, he decided. The little snotling decided that he shall be called Snotius the First. Despite still being nearly blind, Snotius promptly began throwing his weight around and bullying the other snots to do his bidding. Snotius's tiny brain produced yet another thought. He instinctively knew that the fledgling tribe would need 2 more things. They had food, but they needed water and shelter. With 3 snotlings at his command now, Snotius split the work between them. 2 snotlings would remain behind and dig burrows to use as shelter, and the remaining snotling would join the boss and look for water. Before the boss snot went out on his way, he decided he needed something better than a little pointy stick. Digging around in the carcass he recovered, Snotius removed one of the creature's femurs and made himself a nice-sized bone club for future bashing. The snotling boss knew instinctively also that proper bosses had proper hats. He quickly tore the skull of the animal free from its body and set it neatly on top of his head. By the time Snotius departed, his vision had mostly returned. though things were still a bit blurry. He set off with the other snotling into the forest once again. Snotius was by no means a great thinker, but again, he had some basic instincts that guided him. After searching the woods for a little while, the two tiny greenskins came across a wide stream, a veritable river to these tiny snots. The sun shone off the sparkling water, and Snotius removed his skull from his head, reasoning that it would make a fine bucket to take the water back home. But Snotius was not about to do the work himself. No, he was boss now. With a swift kick and an angry prod with his bone club, Snotius, the first of his name, drove the other snotling to the water's edge, holding the skull. As the other snotling bent down to scoop up the water into the skull, an enormous fish with a mouth full of crocodile-like teeth leapt out of the stream and chomped down on the hapless creature. Snotius cried out with concern for his skull. Not wanting to get eaten himself, Snotius walked along the side of the stream, following the skull as it floated all the way downwards. Eventually it washed up on a sandy bank, where the water was shallow. It would be much easier to get water here, not from the deep water where that big fish could eat them. Snotius scooped up his precious skull hat, now properly full of water, and began to head back. Content with his prize, Snotius made his way back to the mushroom patch. The littlest boss felt pretty good. He even had a song in his heart, and hummed to himself as he returned with the water. When he came back, the other two snotlings that he had left behind to dig burrows for shelter had made very little progress. They were arguing about which of them was boss between the two of them, and had barely started digging out the burrows. Snotius was enraged at the delay, and screeched as he swung his skull bucket at one of the bickering snots, crushing part of his skull. Snotius began barking orders at the remaining snotling, who promptly began digging with renewed vigor. By this point, 4 more snotlings had sprouted from the patch, and Snotius put them to work as well, some to digging new burrows, some to building a squig pen, and some, of course, would have to get water that was spilled during the scuffle. Most of what Snotius had done was simply instinct. Look for water, build shelters, make a squig pen. However, in this moment, Snotius had an actual, for real, genuine moment of inspiration. Perhaps it was some mutation in the orc genetic code, or an epigenetic quirk of his circumstances. But Snotius gathered together some sticks and dry grass with an idea in his head. He began to bang 2 rocks together. He was going to make fire. Perhaps the eye of Mork was passing over him, granting the Snotius unnatural cunning. But sparks began to fly. Snotius kept at it. Eventually smoke began to rise. Snotius blew on the smoke, and before long there was a true fire blazing in the middle of camp. The other snotlings gleefully danced around it. The pens were finished. There were burrows for all the snots. There was water. Now was the time for dancing and shrieking. All hailed the name of Snotius I, the greatest snot boss that the planet had ever known, and almost certainly the only one. As Snotius sat on his great stone that he decided was his boss seat, he smiled at the work he had done for Gork and Mork. As the other snots danced, he noticed that there was a strange-looking snot in the corner, with a funny mashed head. Huh. It appeared that the snot he had bashed in the skull earlier had survived. A scowl crossed the snot's face as he stared resentfully at Snotius. The snot boss thought very little of this, though he did think that such a lumpy-headed snot deserved a proper name. Skullbash. Yeah, that sounded good. Skullbash. When the dancing was over, Snotius set a guard for the night to keep the fire going and to keep an eye out for predators. The night was uneventful, and Snotius rose to see his fires still burning, though it was a bit smaller, and the gods looked pretty tired. It was good to see. But the really good thing to see, well, Snotius heard excited shrieks over by the squig pens. Inside were newly sprouted meat squigs. Now, all Snotius had to do was to make sure that the tribe continued to grow and survive long enough for the grots and orcs to sprout. It was good to be boss. For now. No man do they call me. My mother and my father, and all my comrades as well. Thank you all for listening. This is a new series where you all help shape the story. Essentially, these stories are based on role-playing games that I play with my followers on my live streams. Chat is able to democratically decide the next action of the character, or if someone wants to take control of the situation, they can give a super chat in order to decide what the character does next. I will announce these events and when they will happen with as much notice as I can, so please like and comment and subscribe if you like this, and if you want to support me, feel free to donate via PayPal or Patreon, which I have linked below if you would like. Thank you very much again for listening. No Man out.